Chapter 24. The Destroyer returns. How did the most omnious God of the Dark Trinity return? The mystery would provide us with a clue, not only as to how he would return, but when. Moloch in the Soviet Union. The end of child and human sacrifice was replayed in every land where the Christian faith prevailed. But if those nations and civilizations should turn from that faith, what would happen? The dark principalities would return, the ancient blood fury would be revived, and the slaughter of the innocents would begin anew. It is no accident that after renouncing Christianity, that which would soon be known as the Soviet Union became the first state to legalize the killing of unborn children. It did so in 1920, soon after coming to power, with its legalization of abortion. Years later, out of concerns for population growth, the law would be temporarily reversed before being restored again. It is revealing that it was the godless and anti-Christian Soviet Union that was first in the modern world to revive the ancient horror. Moloch in Nazi Germany. In the case of the other demonically anti-Christian power of the 20th century, Nazi Germany, the issue of child sacrifice is more complex. The Third Reich was first concerned with the conquest and proliferation of the master race. Therefore, it was opposed to abortions as much as they affected German or Aryan birth rates. But the Nazis were servants of the gods and ministers of human sacrifice. The blood fury came out in their obsession with slaughtering the sons and daughters of others. Moloch was especially interested in Jewish children. In ancient times he had killed thousands of them. Now his spirit would cause 1.5 million to them to perish. The third god, but as far as a large-scale re-entrance to Moloch into Western civilization and the world, that would require a massive and civilizational turning from God. Again, we are brought back to the pivotal decade of the 1960s. We saw first entrance and workings of Baal, then of Ishtar. Now must come Moloch, the third of the Dark Trinity and the Principality of Death. We would expect, as in ancient times, the spirit of Moloch to set its gaze on little children, the infants that had once been laid on its molten hands. We would expect that it would reacquire their blood and demand their lives, and we would expect its appearance to follow in the wake of the first two gods, and thus in the latter part of that decade or the early part of the next. And that is exactly what happened. And so it began in the late 1960s, when a handful of American states opened the door by legalizing the killing of unborn children. Then on January 22nd in 1973, the Supreme Court legalized the murder of unborn children. Moloch had come to America. Baal to Moloch. He had help. The gods of the Dark Trinity had worked together without Baal laying the groundwork, moving the nation away from its biblical foundation. The idea of taking a human life in the image of God would have been unthinkable, but that foundation had been broken. So too the pagan blurring of distinction, as in the bull-horned images of Baal, had weakened the line between human and animal, and while it perhaps elevated animal life, human life was devalued. Further, the idolatry that came with Baal, in which one could forge one's own idol, create one's own God, and fashion one's own truth and values, meant that there was no more truth or absolutes. Each could do as he or she pleased, and if one could create one's own truth, one now could destroy the truth that actually existed, as in a human life, the unborn child. Ishtar to Molech. Baal ushered in Ishtar, and it was Ishtar who ushered in Molech. Her mythologies were filled with unrestrained sexuality, yet with no apparent thought of desire for or connection to children. Her indulgences led not to life but death. Beyond that was the goddess's deeper work. Her sexual revolution had severed sexuality from marriage, husbands from wives, men from fatherhood, and women from motherhood. The most critical bond of life, that of mother and child, had eroded. The natural maternal instinct to save one's child at all costs was weakened and in some cases gone. And so, as in ancient times, little children were now brought by their mothers to the altars of Molech. The gifts of Ishtar. It is believed that in ancient times the cult of Ashtoreth or Ishtar worked in tandem with the cults of Baal and Molech and the gods of child sacrifice. Children produced by sexual acts in the temples or by Ishtar's prostitutes on the streets provided sacrifices for the gods. So now in modern times, as the sexual revolution bore its fruit, more and more children were conceived outside of marriage and were more likely to be unwanted. Their lives would provide the modern-day sacrifices of Molech. The city on the hill of Molech. America was now offering up its own children as sacrifices. Other nations would be led by its example into taking up the gruesome practice as well. Millions of unborn children around the world would now perish in Molech's shadow. God had warned Israel that if it turned against his ways, if it turned to the gods, it would end up sacrificing its own children, and so it had, and now so too had America, and so too had the nations of the West, and all these had influenced the rest of the world. It was one more step of repaganization, one more piece of the ancient pagan world returning to the modern. The civilization that had, in ancient times, cast out the spirits was now repossessed by them, and America, the shining city on the hill, had now become a blood-soaked high place of Molech. Could one of the most widespread and controversial of practices in American culture go back to the rites on the ancient Canaanites? And could the ancient accounts of those rites give us revelation as to what is taking place in our midst?